Hello there. I was unceremoniously cut off. I had a call come in, and I had to break off. So somewhat awkwardly, since we were getting close to the end, but I'll have to now add another part to this just to get through the remaining bit of material. So we were here talking about the Salem witch trials. Perhaps you know something about it already. There's been plays, movies, etc. Lots of books written about it. A fascinating episode in American history, to be sure. And we were talking about how, in a general sense, this sort of fits with the Puritans' decades long, by this time, fear and anxiety about their status with God. That maybe they weren't predestined, maybe they weren't the chosen people, or not living up to the billing as chosen people. And those Salem witch trials may be an expression, sort of the ultimate expression of this freaking out over, their status, their errand into the wilderness. So the witchcraft trials came after this frenzied series of accusations back and forth. And in a lot of the books about this, the historians and authors have, tried to figure out the cause. And I think that I just mentioned one of them in a broad sense. But there are clear signs that some of this was socioeconomic and sort of class-oriented. In Salem, which was really the original town in Massachusetts, even before Plymouth or Massachusetts Bay Colony. So it was kind of an independent town at first. And it had been around from the beginning, but only was sort of famous for witchcraft from 1692 until now. But there was originally kind of a group in the town, kind of the old group and their descendants, who were tended to be, convinced, strict Puritans. And there was sort of a newer group coming in more recent decades who were often not Puritans, or kind of less tried and true Puritans, more there for economic reasons and non-religious reasons. And a lot of the accusations, when we look at it again socially, came from kind of the older group who were suspicious of the newer group coming in, kind of seeing them as outsiders and seeing them as not really fitting in because they didn't toe the line necessarily on religion, at least not as much as expected. So there were a lot of reasons, sort of to explain how this happened. And it's probably a bit of truth in some or all of them. Sometimes there seems to have been just scores that were settled here, that once they began, somebody saw an advantage in accusing somebody else. Say, women weren't usually supposed to, by law, own property. But if, say, a woman inherited property because her husband died, left to her in his will, then that was considered legal. But that was also considered suspicious. There was something that some scholars now refer to as sort of the witch profile. So if you there was a kind of a kind of stereotype view of what a witch was or looked like, what kind of person it was, and the closer you fit to that, the more chance that an accusation would be made, and the more chance that it would stick, and you might be convicted. Because even men could get tried for witchcraft. As you see at the very bottom, 144 were arrested in the Salem witch trials in the end, 19 executed, 5 of them men. So men could and did get accused, even executed, for witchcraft, but it was less common because the profile was that it was usually a woman, usually an older woman, usually kind of a widowed older woman who maybe owned property herself. So if the more of those stereotypes that you fit as a human being, the more likely it was that you'd get accused. It wasn't for sure. You might get accused and acquitted. We see most of those that were accused were acquitted. That's cold comfort, of course, to us and to those that were arrested and terrified, as anybody would have been. But nonetheless, it does show that they went through a judicial process, and however flawed by our standards, and it certainly was flawed by our standards, that they did have a process. They weren't just arresting everybody or everyone they were arresting. They were sending to be hung, executed. They were going through a process, and they pretty much stuck to it, even if it wasn't rational by our standards. So The accusations spread for all kinds. Oh, the woman I said that, hypothetically, uh, there might be scores to settle if it was. I'm. There are many examples of this kind of thing that may have been the reason for accusations. I'm just picking out one sort of hypothetically. So if a woman who was survived her husband's death, inherited the property, let's say she has a nephew, a male nephew, well, I guess a nephew's a male, but a nephew who's greedy, maybe doesn't like her anyway, knows that such a person is part of the, is high on the witchcraft profile, and thinks to himself, you know what, I don't really like her anyway. What if someone was just someone anonymously was to accuse her of witchcraft, and the authorities came out to investigate and question her, and they were, you know, convinced that she was a witch or might be as well, and took her into custody. And what if it went all the way to trial and she was found guilty and executed? Who's next in line to inherit the property? Oh, it's me. So these kind of things surely happened, and we have some evidence that, in specific cases, that they likely did happen. So this is a very bizarre series of events overall. The court accepted evidence, spectral evidence as it was called, and the what did that mean? Well, this is where it got irrational from our standards. If a witness said they saw a spectral image of someone, which basically meant if I dreamt that you were at a crime scene and they questioned me, and I said, "Hey, I had this sort of image. I was dreaming, but it was like an alternate reality. It was still real, and I saw that person there committing this crime." That was actually considered good evidence. So by our standards, this is just craziness. Nonetheless, they did stick to, again, as I said, standards on this stuff. So they at least were consistent, or at least relatively consistent about it. But in the end, I think this sort of fits into the bigger picture rather neatly, if frighteningly, here, as I've laid out, in that this sort of seems to me to be the ultimate sign that the Puritans are panicking about whether their experiment actually did have God's blessing at this late date. So I'm backtracking now. I skipped the case of Roger Williams and Hutchinson because these are huge in understanding 17th century Massachusetts and New England. Williams was a prominent minister, so one of those very well-educated, bright guys, and he was appointed as minister to Salem Church. This is decades before the Salem witch trial, so I'm going back in time here, long before it was associated with witchcraft. So what we're about to talk about has nothing to do with witchcraft. It just, Salem is the same town earlier on. He was a hero, or seen as a hero, in support of freedom of religion, and freedom of conscience, and seeing a danger, or I'm sorry, he's seen as a hero by some, but at the time that he lived, the authorities saw him as a danger to authority and survival of the colony. So was he a hero, or did those that prosecuted him and sent him packing have reason to? The problem with Roger Williams is that he couldn't shut up. He quickly started speaking out on all kinds of issues, political and otherwise. And as a prominent minister, the ministers were prominent, period. He's going to, everyone's going to know what he said, and it's going to cause a stir if it's controversial, and it was. Among other claims, he stated that England's legal claims to Native American lands, and there were many. Basically, the colonies, as they sort of come into, just like Virginia, we already talked about, Massachusetts, they just claim all the land to the west of where they are, even if they haven't explored it. We lay claim to everything in that direction. And so there are vast amounts of land that the kings of England claimed were theirs. And Williams said those claims are illegal and invalid as claimed for England by the king, because the king called his island kingdom or country, England, a Christian kingdom. and Williams believed that no government could rightly call itself Christian, therefore the land claims were invalid. So there's a lot to sort of talk about there, but the really important point for us is that the fact that he, whatever his argument, however good or silly, it's like you are telling the King of England or announcing to everyone that the King of England's claim to land is invalid. That's going to get you into hot water with maybe the king and the English government. And so it's somewhat understandable, I think, under those circumstances. And there are other things he spoke out about as well, some of which I think are more defensible and maybe even were good things. And he spoke out in ways that were, constructive and leading towards freedom and freedom of religion, etc. That's true. But on this and even some other things, I can see why the authorities came to him, and this is what they did: talked to him over and over and said, dude, could you just change your public statements? Stop talking so much. If you believe that privately, fine, but don't say that in the middle of a sermon when you got 100 people sitting in the room. It's going to get out, and it's going to get back to the King of England. If you keep doing this, the King's going to pull our charter. Our colony is going to collapse because the King's going to take it from us because of your big mouth. At first he agreed to kind of stop, but he's just one of those guys, I guess, that couldn't stop himself from, saying what he wanted to say, and he paid the price for it. They ultimately banned him or banished him from the from Massachusetts Bay Colony. He went on to be one of the founders of Rhode Island, which was the first colony in the 13 colonies to be based from the beginning on the idea of freedom of religion. So that makes him look very open-minded in a way that the previous episode does not. And again, there's, I think, a little bit of truth to both of these viewpoints here. But even the freedom of religion thing in Rhode Island kind of came about as a number of kind of dissenting groups from one Puritan New England colony after another kind of went somewhere else to find land because they didn't agree with, or the authorities didn't agree with them. So and they all kind of met up in Rhode Island. And so now it's a hodgepodge of groups, some Quakers even there, that had different religious views already anyway. So if Williams wanted to be a leader there, unless he just conquered everybody else by force and forced them into his brand of religion, he had really no choice. But hey, this should be an open society when it comes to religion. Everyone should have the freedom to preach and practice the religion, their religion as they see fit. Well, yeah, you kind of have to say that, don't you? Otherwise, your religion might be, under suspicion, let alone someone else's. So Williams is often seen as a hero, but and I'm not saying he's a villain by any means. It's another example of how complicated historical interpretation can be. I do think the authorities who were thinking about the survival of the colony did have a point, at least with some of the things that he was saying and apparently believing. The case of Anne Hutchinson is even more incredible and more famous, partly because Hutchinson was a woman. And why does this make it more remarkable? Because it was, in a sense, expected, or sort of seen as more acceptable, if a man like Roger Williams spoke out publicly, criticized, the government, or criticized, something about society. But it was in many ways unthinkable that a woman do so. Again, for sexist, misogynist reasons. Nonetheless, Roger Williams caused a stir. Anne Hutchinson's case caused a much, much bigger stir. And they only happened a year apart from each other in the same place, in the same colony. So both of these events sort of, back-to-back rocked, like two back-to-back earthquakes rocked Massachusetts Bay Colony. And also these are examples of how and why the original congregational system, whereby there were no higher authorities than each individual church, eventually was changed with the Cambridge Platform, and they placed some sort of authority, some sort of mechanism for rules to rein people in. These events sort of show that this could be too anarchic. Hutchinson has often been, and is sometimes still seen as a hero for freedom of worship, and a forerunner of women's rights. And both of those may be true in some ways. So, like Roger Williams, I think the reality is complicated, but there's some truth in that. She's certainly a remarkable figure in history. There was a lot that was impressive about her, not only the guts and the courage to stand up and make public criticisms of the leaders of the colony, in this case the ministers, the most prominent ones themselves, but she had an intimate knowledge of the Bible, a bright woman. She came from the gentry class. Her and her husband had moved from England to follow John Cotton, one of the most famous and powerful Puritan ministers. When he left England to migrate to Massachusetts Bay Colony, they went with him. So did a bunch of others. They were so devoted to his preaching that they went with him. And they had a big house, so she was sort of an upper class woman. And she was sort of used to, speaking out in a wealthy family, and she didn't stop doing it here. And remember, the Puritans in England and in New England, to a lesser degree, actually were okay with women sort of speaking out, at least in sort of church and church meetings, church, discussion groups, things like that. But not necessarily when it sort of came to this kind of much of a public criticism of, ministers who were also kind of political leaders at the same time, however, informally. So she started holding religious meetings in her own home, where scripture and religious/theological issues were discussed and debated. Again, fairly common for Puritans, even especially for women. But so that part of it didn't necessarily raise eyebrows. But she began to criticize the majority of the colony's ministers. John Wilson, who I've already mentioned, preacher at First Boston, was maybe the most criticized of all. And he was a prominent, sort of right in the center of focus minister. But she criticized so many of them for preaching a covenant of works, meaning what someone does will get them into heaven. That really means the Catholic doctrine of works, right? Salvation by works. You get into heaven by becoming a better person by what you do. Saying, a number of Hail Marys and, confessing, helping the poor on the weekends or whatever, and whatever the priest tells you to do, you start turning your life around, and your actions, what you do, your good works, get you into heaven. Which really means that she was accusing the preachers of basically preaching a Catholic, version of Christianity, which, I mean, the ministers are not going to take that well, because they detested Catholicism, and so to be, in a sense, accused of it. She didn't use the word, I don't believe, but more or less that's what's being said. So criticizing them for preaching a covenant of works over a covenant of grace, which was more in line with sort of the Puritan doctrine of predestination, though hers was the minority version. I know this is confusing. The minority version we've already talked about, that I stole the phrase from one preacher at the time, God's caress, that she believed it wasn't so much you knew that you were, predestined because of you're looking at your life and sort of what you've done. I must be saved because I've done this, this, and this. It was I feel God's presence. I feel God's caress. And that in itself was somewhat controversial, and in the end was kind of her undoing. But she developed many prominent and devoted supporters, many of them women. And of course, then this starts to raise eyebrows. She's criticizing the ministers for, something that's really kind of a serious transgression to Puritans, and developing a lot of support, especially amongst women. And it kind of looked like a political movement, of a group of sort of women organizing. And again, I say that because that was just unheard of at the time. Now it's sort of, women organized just like anybody else as a group. But in those days, it was considered sort of, not the way societies were supposed to work, at least from the man's perspective. So, and even from a lot of women's perspective, to be quite frank. So she started to get into hot water herself. The colony was deeply divided over the issue, as it was about predestination as a whole. Hutchinson actually claimed, quote, that assurance of salvation was conveyed not by action, but by an essentially mystical experience. Again, what I've called God's grace, experience of grace, an inward conviction of the coming of the Spirit to the individual that bore no relationship to moral conduct whatsoever. So she's saying the ministers are wrong in preaching that you can do good works and then sort of change your status with God to get into heaven. Uh, but it's not even true that, right, the typical Puritan way, outside of Catholicism, a Protestant way, a Calvinist way of thinking about God's salvation is through the one that means I can just sort of examine my life and see that I must, the things that have happened and have unfolded in my life show that I must have been predestined. That's not even acceptable really to her. She's saying, no, you have this inner feeling that God, as you've been predestined, predetermined. It's sort of like when somebody says, this is always a conversation you want to leave. You don't want to stay in this conversation when you ask them, well, how do they know? How do you know? I just know. No, but how do you know? I just know. So this is, in a sense, what she's saying. What she did was impressive in many ways. By the way, she had 15 kids. She was a midwife, which basically meant she was a doctor in those days. There weren't too many doctors this early in New England's history, so midwives were delivering babies. They were basically OB-GYNs. So she was an impressive woman. There's no doubt about it. She defended herself at her trials. There was a church trial and a civil, a government trial. She defended herself, and apparently brilliantly. Again, she knew the Bible chapter and verse, and and sort of defended herself very eloquently. The problem was, like all the leaders on the other side came up against her, including Governor Winthrop, who spoke out against her at the trial. Remember, Winthrop was a trained lawyer, but the fact that Winthrop showed up to, and participated in the trial shows you how big this event got and how big of a transgression she was seen to have committed by this time. But like the case of Roger Williams and Mary Dyer, the Quaker who was executed, she was given numerous chances to change her views. She was spoken to privately by leaders on multiple occasions, but when she continued to, persisted, she was put on trial in sort of both arenas. And in the government trial, she was convicted, and that meant she was banished from the colony. In the church trial, she was kicked out of the church, meaning she was excommunicated from the church. So in two different ways, she was cast out by the Puritan colony of Massachusetts Bay. Now, again, it is tempting to sort of look at this as a women's rights issue. I'm not saying it can't be. Certainly, she's an impressive person, in all the ways I mentioned. But what often gets left out, and I didn't even put it on the screen here myself, I don't think it's in our textbook, is that there were a couple other ministers that were accused and convicted of the exact same thing, because it wasn't just her, it was kind of a group of people. And they were men. So that doesn't get much attention. A guy named John Wheelwright was one of the others. And I think his trial was actually sort of put ahead of her trial. So it can be seen as a women's issue in some ways. Certainly the fact that she was, an extremely assertive person, right, in a time when women weren't supposed to be overall, it is something to look back with, as an inspirational figure for women, after her, people studying her now. To cut against the grain that courageously takes quite a bit of guts and ability to sort of just say I'm going to do this because I feel it's right. So yeah, it can be seen as a women's issue, but not quite to the extent that it's sometimes I think been made out to be. She eventually moved to with her husband and others who supported her interviews to Rhode Island, and then on to other places. She ended up on Long Island in New York and was tragically killed in a fight with Native Americans, a war or a skirmish, I forget now. But certainly a remarkable woman. And both the cases of Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson back to back do illustrate that though the Puritans tried to sort of be united and create this sort of these godly Republican systems, these Bible commonwealths where everybody was kind of unified on the same page. It didn't always work out that way. There was lots of room for disagreement and a lot of sort of bitter disputes that took place within the Puritan communities. So the long-term consequences, mostly unintended, of Puritan influence, I'll just summarize since these are my own words anyway, by reading. Early expression, understanding of ordered liberty and sort of the common good, really dealt with ordered liberty. They helped to establish the foundations of democratic institutions and ideas. We talked about the town meetings, participatory democracy, right? So a lot of participation by average people in government structured into the system. Egalitarianism, equality in the sense of sort of more opportunity for different people here, not for everybody, but certainly more so than in Virginia and some of the other colonies and most places in Europe. We see at least the beginnings of freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, individualism here. Not that was exclusive to the Puritans. We'll see it in other colonies as well, other groups in England and Europe, but the Puritans contributed to it rather heavily. The foundations of American exceptionalism are, I think, evident in Puritan beliefs about them being the chosen people. That idea has, I think, sort of lasted through to the present in our history, for good or bad, depending on what you think of American exceptionalism. America as an exceptional nation. The idea phrase has fallen on hard times recently, and I see why. There's plenty to be said against it, but the argument can be made on both sides, and has been for years. The Puritans, in some ways, were the wellspring, or one of the wellsprings of American ingenuity, progress. We noted they made great capitalists. They're the pressure cooker and anxiety-producing belief in predestination, as I said, sort of propelled them, was an engine of efforts and energy and work. Their tendency to examine themselves, constantly sort of re-examine themselves, think about how we can be better, do better, the strong work ethic, all of that sort of led to success, not only for them, but I think, as has been said for a long time, it's kind of vague, but I still think it is likely to hold true, that this rubbed off on sort of the larger, U.S. eventually. This Puritan value system sort of spilled over into mainstream society. Not so much the religious part of it, but the values became secularized. The work ethic, the self-examination, the other elements of sort of putting off pleasure till later, being punctual, those kind of things sort of became part of the American value system, just outside of religion as well. It entered sort of the economy, politics, and society in general. The Puritans also, as the Calvinists, they're both Calvinists, but the Calvinists in Europe as well, they kind of led in the direction of reason, logic, scientific discovery. We have a notion that's common today that Christianity and religion in general are antithetical to reason and logic and science. Did I say that the wrong way? getting tired here. We have a tendency, let me say it again. We have a tendency to think, I'll simplify, to think that religion and science, for instance, are always sort of at odds with each other. Well, that's not how people saw it necessarily then. All the way back to the beginnings of Christian history, you see the majority of influential figures believing that reason and science, and logic, were complements to faith, help to prove faith, help to bolster faith, or another way to approach God. And the Puritans definitely believed in this, which also helps to sort of explain how they took education and eventually worldly success in education quite seriously and took it quite far. Thanks.